A warm welcome to everyone, and thank you for joining us today. I am Sophie Lambin, the editorial partner for the Women's Forum for the Economy and Society. At the Women's Forum, we believe that women's voices and vision are critical to drive an inclusive recovery and accelerate progress as we look beyond the devastation of the COVID-19 pandemic. The virus has shown us the urgent need to reshape the world together, as well as the central role of women leadership. To that end, together with the New York Times, we are hosting a series of conversations with women from around the world, women from the front line, women leading us through the crisis and the recovery. Today, we look forward to a dynamic conversation with a speaker who has experience driving both equality and progress for women and families around the world. You'll be able to follow our conversation on social media with the hashtag #WomenForInclusion and in her words. You'll also be able to submit your questions, which we will feed into the speaker room here with our moderator. So it's my great pleasure to welcome the New York Times Gender Director, Francesca Donner, who will be leading our conversation today. Francesca, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Sophie. When COVID-19 broke onto the global scene a few months ago, it was ostensibly a health crisis. People worried about getting sick, getting others sick, overwhelming hospitals. But it became clear almost immediately that it was so much more than just a health disaster. The world wasn't ready, not socially, not economically, and certainly not from a health perspective. Fragile systems and safety nets cracked almost immediately. And while, yes, men were more likely to die from the virus by the numbers, women and girls were disproportionately affected in other ways. Women in labor were turned away from hospitals. Contraceptive chains broke down. Abortions were put on hold. Domestic violence skyrocketed, as everyone knew it would. Jobs were lost, but especially in sectors dominated by women, while other job categories in which women also dominated, nurses, caregivers, things like that, put women directly in harm's way. Family economies were pinched, leaving women to figure out how to make up the gap. And as schools shuttered, so the burden of unpaid labor grew. This is not the first time the world has confronted a health crisis, and it certainly won't be the last. So I'd like to talk about what we know, what we've learned, and how we can use this as a moment to rebuild better. Joining me today, I have Melinda Gates, who needs no introduction other than to say she is the co-chair of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and the author of The Moment of Lift, which you should read. She is also the author of a paper published yesterday in Foreign Affairs in which she lays out some of her ideas on building back a more equitable world during and post-COVID. So thank you, Melinda. Thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you. I'd like to begin by asking you perhaps the most obvious, but maybe most essential question, which is why gender, why girls, why women? From the very start of this crisis, the message seems to have been handed down by so many that now is not the time to worry about women's issues when we have to be searching for a vaccine and saving lives. But you have framed your building back model specifically through gender. Why?
Because I think, this pandemic has exposed for us the cracks and the fault lines in our society. And they often fall along race, gender, and poverty lines. And so if we're going to build back society and build it back as quickly as we possibly can, the way to do that is to put women straight at the center, because guess what? They're already at the center. They're already the ones dealing with kids at home, taking care of the elderly, trying to make sure that there's food on the table or the job is kept. And so if we want to build society back and have it be better, but also have a quicker recovery, then we have to look at the specific gender pieces that we need to work on in country after country around the world.
You cited in your recent paper that I just mentioned a pretty staggering statistic that even a 4-year delay in taking action to improve parity would erase 5 trillion in opportunity from global GDP in 2030. If nothing else, big numbers should make policymakers sit up and take action. Why hasn't it happened yet? Is it simply entrenched customs? And what do we do to get beyond that?
Yes, I think in the past, we've so often thought of the women's issues as a side issue or a nice to have. When we get to everything else, we'll do the women's piece. But the converse is absolutely true, which is we know, like, if we're in a pandemic now, it's like a world war. When we came out of the World War, most governments wanted women to keep working. They knew that society would not only be better, they'd build their economy more quickly. And so during this time, if we start to say, look, what is it we want to build back? What do we want society to look like, and how do we want to speed that up? Then you look at the women's issues and you say, okay, look, in most countries, women are working. They're either working in the informal sector or the formal sector. In a high income or middle income country, that means doing things like paid family leave policies that allows a woman to care for her loved ones as needed, but also to work. In a country that's maybe a low income country, it looks like things like good policy around making sure that women have access to mobile phones, to the internet, and a bank account. Because we know that when a woman has a bank account and can save $1 a day, $2 a day, she invests the money on behalf of her family. It leads to truly empowerment of her in the family. And we have good data suggest she's more likely to enter the formal economy. So for all those reasons, you look at good policy around women.
Totally. And I mean, one of the issues that's really, I think, getting in the way of actually women being able to work is the dreaded unpaid labor. And I feel like we can't possibly go through a COVID conversation without discussing it. We've seen it magnified at this time. And whatever safety nets people had, childcare, help from families, schools, daycares, you name it, it basically disappeared overnight. Even in a normal world, unpaid work is a burden for women. And I'm wondering if it's fair or realistic to suggest that this might be a time to start solving for that. We've lived with it for so long. Women have just kind of dealt with it, but it's becoming almost impossible, and it's become too big to ignore, I think. So I would be curious to hear a few more of the solutions that you might have for that, and how might we bring men into the solution beyond handing them a cleaning brush.
I think that for so long, our economies are built on the back of women's unpaid labor. And we don't want to admit it. It's been this sort of invisible issue. Women do 2.5 times more work at home than men do, no matter what country in the world you look at. But here's the good thing about this crisis, is you never want to waste a good crisis. And in this crisis, what was invisible is now completely visible. I get on conference calls, video calls all the time with men, and they want to pull their hair out as much as their wives do, because the kids are running around the house and they are trying to figure out, okay, it's my turn to make sure that the schooling happens online, or my wife is working. Okay, it's my turn to do this. And so even men are starting to say, oh my gosh, we have to solve the child care piece of this. We need to solve the elderly care. I've been on calls with many men now who've lost their parents because of COVID-19. And so I think we have to use this opportunity to reframe our entire narrative. Our narrative has always been, well, we'll get to that. No, the narrative is we are doing this now in society. We are trying to care for the young and the elderly and keep food on the table. So given that we are doing this, men and women, what policies do we want to put in place when we build a stimulus package, when we are doing cash transfer payments? How do you make sure you look specifically at the female piece of it? Because again, money in the hands of a woman is invested differently on her family than when it's in the hands of a man. And so now is our time.
Right. And do you think it does come down to policy? Because one of the other things I've worried about is that, yes, it's all exposed right now and men are sort of opening their eyes and looking around. But, I'm worried that it may end up springing back like a rubber band and everything kind of goes back into place. So how do you prevent that from happening, especially with schools kind of maybe opening, maybe not. And it seems to be shouldered by women who are sitting there thinking, oh my God, if schools don't open, I guess it'll be up to me to quit my job and stay home.
And so that conversation starts in your home. If we don't have the bold and brave conversations at our homes to start saying who's doing what here, And how do we redistribute the workload at home? And then we have to have the conversation in the community. How do we redistribute what goes on in our community? And then you have it in the workplace. How do we redistribute the load? Because this is visible right now, and we are, those of us who are lucky enough to work from home, we're seeing it. It's up to us with the others, like with the essential workers who are out getting on the bus and going to their job, to say, what is it we want next? Who are our elected officials who will get us there? Who are elected officials who are putting in the right stimulus packages? Who are our elected officials that are opening mobile wallets to women and bringing down the internet prices so they have access to that phone? We have to vote for the right people. We have to listen to the advocates on the ground who really know the situation, for instance, in terms of gender-based violence. And then we have to hold our leaders accountable, men and women, to creating the right policy and laws to change these cracks that we've had in society for so long.
Totally. I'm just curious. I want to go back to the caregiver point again. And this may kind of be a US framed question, but, for so long, I think women in particular who have done the lioness's share of caregiving have sort of tried to closet those responsibilities. They just don't jibe with the image of the ideal employee. And now that's kind of been cracked open, well, definitely been cracked open. And I'm wondering, do you think caregiving will ever sort of be put back in the box, or is it here to stay and open and being talked about? I love the idea of kind of bringing it up in the family. I love the idea of bringing it out into the community, talking about it with your employer. Is that realistic, do you think, for most people?
Yes. We have to make it realistic. And it is. Look, the fact that Congress, we're the only industrialized nation in the world, the only one that doesn't have a paid family medical leave policy. When I talk to lawmakers on the Hill now, because they had to put it in the second stimulus bill, or they chose to, it's now wide open for debate. And so we have to use these moments when things are exposed and step right into them and push for what's right for society. And so, yes, I don't think work is going to go back to the way it was completely after this is over, but we have to make sure those gaps are filled and that people say, this is what we expect. This is good policy for our country. And that is a United States specific lens. But again, we have to look at as a global community, all the caregiving that women do around the world and what holds them back from having the job in society that they want, or the productive work they want, in addition to the loving caregiving or laborious work they do at home for caregiving.
Right. I mean, I think, hand in hand with this is the school problem. And again, I'm sort of looking at it from a US angle, but I know it goes way beyond the US. Paul Krugman wrote a damning opinion piece in the New York Times the other day with the headline, "We drank away our children's future." And to synthesize, basically, in our rush to reopen bars, parties, allow gatherings, we forgot the most vulnerable of all, and perhaps the most important, which is our children, which of course has the knock-on effect of hobbling parents who are now stuck in this position of seeing some kind of hybrid version of school, if there is school, while also getting back to work. And it's such a problem. And it's sort of interesting to hear you mention policy when some of these policies that opened bars and allowed all this to happen were directly handed down by US leadership. And so how do we make people sort of reprioritize things if that's what should happen? I mean, I think the school situation is just about as dire as it gets.
We elect new officials. We demand more, from all of our leaders at the local level, the state level, and the federal level. And I think you're going to see that come the November elections. I mean, look at the countries who have done well with these problems. We have so many exemplars. Look at South Korea. Look at Germany. Okay. Look at many countries in Europe. They did the appropriate lockdown. That's the only tool we have is, recede, do it for a time. Make sure you do testing appropriately at the national level. You do contact tracing, isolation, and quarantine. We know that works. Then you tell people to wear masks, and you begin, as your number comes down, your epidemic numbers come down, you slowly and carefully reopen schools and you watch and you wait and you look at your numbers and you reopen a little bit more, you slowly reopen businesses. Those are sensible policies. There are schools open around the world safely. So yes, the US has been completely lacking at leadership on this issue. And because of that, we have put our children and our elderly at the greatest risk in the world. And that is a crime.
Right. Okay, on to the next terrible thing. One of the most devastating consequences of this in the US, and also certainly beyond the US, has been around maternal and reproductive care. You wrote in your piece that these need to be classified as essential. And it just makes me ask, how did we ever get to a place where they were ever inessential? Is it simply that women were deemed expendable, that it didn't matter? Or do you think it was more that this kind of care was overlooked because no women were in the room pounding the table for it?
It's because the women didn't have the seat at the table. I mean, even medical research for many, many, many years, we didn't test drugs on men and women or a new vaccine. We tested them all on men. We still don't collect data about women and women's lives. But we do know these are essential. Women will tell you all over the world when they can decide if and when to have children and how to space the births of their children, then they have opportunity in their family. We know there's no country in the world that has gone from low to middle to high income without making the transition of allowing contraceptives to women. And so you teach women about their bodies, you allow contraceptives, you make sure there's multiple different types, so she has a different type at a different time in her life. She makes the decision. She takes the decision for herself. When you do that, we have fabulous data. This is something we do have data about. Women are healthier, the children are healthier and better educated, and the family is wealthier when she can space the births of her children. And so it's one of those things that you have to look at all the time, and particularly during a time of crisis. We know from Ebola, the 4 affected countries in 2014, the teen pregnancy rate went up. Maternal mortality went up. It rose with Ebola. It was a shadow pandemic. So we have to make sure we keep this front and center on the agenda.
Yeah, it's staggering to me. I mean, we looked at, we did some stories where women were just not able to get an abortion, which, I mean, that can't wait. It's staggering to me. Also on the data point, I'm so glad you brought that up. I've actually been thinking about it a lot in relation to PPE, which is for our audience, personal protective equipment, things like masks, gowns, gloves that are worn by healthcare workers. And while we were all scrambling to get it because there wasn't enough, we overlooked the one big thing, which is it wasn't designed to fit women. And it's been like this forever. And there isn't any data that I know of that is sort of looking at this. And I'm curious to know, like, have you heard anything about this changing? Is there any way we can make this change? Who should we write to? It's sort of a staggering oversight, but it seems to be one of those things that people sort of shrug their shoulders and say, oh, well, that's just the way it's made. What are your thoughts on that?
Which is unusual, right? Because 70% of the healthcare workers around the globe are women. So again, it comes down to women's leadership. Did they have a seat at the table and a voice when the design happened? And the answer is no from history. And this is why we need to make sure that we empower women to have their voices and to have seats at the table, there's huge power in the grassroots collective. I have lots of examples of that from around the world. And there's power at the head seat of the table, at, the head of a company or the director level or the board level or the design level, when you have more than one woman with a seat at the table. So that it's not just one woman fighting against the system. Once you have women at the table and you have people with different perspectives and diversity, they bring a different lens from society, right? Because women have worn so many hats in society for so long. And so they have this perspective. And you absolutely have enlightened men, men who care, men who want to do the right thing. We have to become allies in this. And when we make sure that women have those powerful positions, whether it's in Congress or in Parliament or a seat at the table or at the grassroots community organization or a mayor, when they start to have that power, they bring different issues and they create different solutions and different policies. And that's why it's so important to have a diverse set of opinions sitting at a table.
Yeah. I mean, I think in this crisis, there were so many moments where you heard about a shortage of tampons and sanitary products for menstruation. And even, I think it was a result of even men who love women sort of forget that they have periods once a month. And it was just sort of a total oversight. But again, I don't think a woman would forget that. I want to just go back to your point about leadership. I know you've written a lot about sort of grassroots leadership, and I would love to hear a little bit more about how we get those voices specifically at the table, because, you know, a lot of the case studies that you've written about really kind of show that they know the problem better than anyone else because they're living the problem. And so how do you get those voices so often overlooked, so often marginalized? How do you get them in the room with the leaders or the CEOs or whoever else is already in there?
Well, I think, first of all, we fund those organizations, and it doesn't take a lot, but you fund them so that you make sure you sponsor and give them mentorship to come to these online forums. I was just on a call earlier this morning with a group of very senior female leaders around the world. And the thing we all recognize is we said, why aren't there more grassroots organizations on this call of 15 of us? Like, next time we're all going to bring 2 or 3 of them because we need to hear from them. And we need to give up our social platforms at times to these young people who have the voice, who see what's going on. What I know about the power of the collective is when you get a grassroots organization together, a group of women, and again, we do have data on this from around the world, there are millions and millions of women in networks in India and in Africa. My examples from India that I've seen firsthand, and I've seen them in Africa, is when women get together and start to discuss the real issues, there's power in being together. They see their stories. They can stand up en masse and go to the police and say, you are going to come deal with the rape that's in our village. We are going to have our voice. They can go and demand HIV services and say, you're not giving me my rights. In Africa, you see the women come together, and if only a couple of them have a cell phone, they'll figure out how to share those to all get one account and use one PIN to start saving money because they know the power in saving money together. So women have amazing ideas and amazing power when they're together. Even during this time, girls' collectives, again, we know from the Ebola crisis, the girls who stayed in their collectives, their adolescent collectives, used more birth control, and the teen pregnancy rate was lower amongst those girls than everywhere else in the country. And so, like in Niger today, girls are gathering, but they're realizing we need to gather in smaller groups, more distance, different times of the day. We have to gather women together because it's their stories, and then we have to elevate them and make sure we fund them. Even politically, we need to make sure we put more money in female politicians' campaigns so they have a shot at making these big, make it to the state house or into these big roles.
Totally. I mean, we've also seen that in women gathering in protests. They play really interesting roles in protests and can be quite powerful en masse. I want to take a quick moment just to talk about vaccine development and perhaps even more importantly, vaccine distribution. We've read in the news, we've got a few promising leads, but frankly, nobody can do this alone. And I would love to hear your thoughts on how you get global leaders to work together and not be individualistic about this. And what do you think is America's role in this?
Well, so we're seeing unprecedented cooperation in terms of, why do we even have a chance that we might get a vaccine by next year? Well, it's because people are working so rapidly and sharing results, sharing phase 1 as soon as they get it, trying to align manufacturing even before we know which vaccine is going to go through which types of manufacturing plants. The biggest concern, though, is that the vaccine not go to the highest bidder when it comes out. It is fundamental that this vaccine, when it comes out, first goes to healthcare workers. The 60 million healthcare workers around the globe who are keeping the rest of us safe, who are putting their lives on the line in these health systems, in our hospitals, our clinics, they deserve this vaccine first. And I don't care where you live. And after that, then the most vulnerable populations deserve to get the vaccine. And that will be country by country, where governments will have to decide who are the most vulnerable pieces and parts of our population. And so we're finally seeing some global leadership. You're seeing some of the European leaders step up and say, how do we make sure that there's manufacturing capacity so that it's not just for our European country, but it's also for the low and middle income countries? Philanthropy is absolutely playing a role in these conversations. Bill and I and many of the institutions that all of us work with, Gavi, the Alliance for Vaccines and Immunization, has a seat at the table, as do many, many other partners, with the whole goal in mind of how do we make sure these vaccines don't just go to high-income countries first, but they get to low and middle-income countries swiftly as well. And luckily, we have this vaccine alliance called Gavi, Global Alliance for Vaccines and Immunizations. It's been around for 20 years, and it knows, with all of the partner countries, how to get a new vaccine directly into their supply chain, and then countries get it out to the most remote areas. And that's how it will get out.
Yeah, that's good. Since you mentioned this, and I'm glad you brought up the foundation itself, I want to ask you a quick question about the role of the foundation. And, you know, COVID has kind of handed us these problems that feel almost too big to solve. And I feel like when people lose faith in the systems to solve these problems, they often turn to philanthropists and foundations like yours for moonshots with a kind of "we can't you" attitude. And I'd really like to hear from you your take on, you know, we sort of know what the Gates Foundation can do, but where do you draw the line? Where are the limits on what you can or should do? And as a sort of follow up to that, what should we or you ask of others?
So all of foundation or philanthropy can do is to be that catalytic wedge, to show ways and points of light, and to remind people of why we're doing what we do in the best of humanity. So look, the moonshots are coming from the pharmaceutical companies who are investing. We can invest alongside of them and incent them, just like government can incent them to build out more manufacturing plants earlier, not just for high-income countries, but middle and low income. So we can be a catalyst, quite honestly, or a prod sometimes, to make sure the right things happen, make sure the prices come down as quickly as they can. We happen because we've been working in this vaccine space for quite some time. We know many of the vaccine manufacturers in other parts of the world, in the middle income countries, that we can do tech transfers to. So that's the role of philanthropy. We can't begin to cover the gaps, but we can also remind people of the best of humanity and that there are real solutions to these problems. I mean, even the thing you brought up earlier, quite honestly, about menstruation. There are millions of women who are dealing with that every single month all over the world, and we never even think about that they don't have access to those products. But we can keep those issues front and center, whether it's a vaccine, whether it's a new medicine when it comes out. Again, luckily, we have something called the Global Fund as a global community because of HIV, tuberculosis, and malaria. If we get a good medicine for COVID-19, that will be the distribution mechanism to get it out to the world, and so that it doesn't get hoarded by one or two countries.
Totally. I've got two questions which I'm going to jam in, even though I have no more time. One is quite an interesting question from someone in our audience, and she said, "Don't you feel the narrative of women being victims is losing its impact?" She put victims in quotes. "As a woman, I am rather bored of hearing it." So I find that sort of interesting, and I wonder if you can speak to whether you feel we are putting women in this role of victim. If you could speak to that for a minute, and then I'm going to end with a final question as a wrap up.
Women are the engines of society, and we need to see them that way. Yes, they often fall back, or if they're in a domestic violence situation, they are a victim. But for the most part, women, when they have their voice and when we help them have their full decision-making capability, that is a seat at the table, money for their women-led business, the right policies so they can work and care for their children, then they are the engines of society and they have amazing ideas. Part of what I do even outside the foundation is fund women-led businesses because, again, they have amazing ideas where there are whole markets that men just don't see, but that women do see, and products that women want to buy and men want to buy. So I see them as economic engines, and we need to shift the narrative, and this is the time to do it.
I think that's great. So that question was from the head of diversity at BNP. And now for my final question for you. I think this is a Melinda question. It is about a moment of lift. So the world has been dealt the most terrible hand. And I would like to ask you, what moments of lift, to borrow your own phrasing, do you see emerging from this? Have there been any so far? And maybe, if you don't mind, take 30 seconds just to explain to our audience what you mean by moment of lift.
Moment of lift is that time when, if you're looking at a rocket leaving the Earth and it's going to catapult into space, the engines are lit, they're rumbling, they're ready to go, and then you lift off against gravity and you head off to the moon. Those lifts, the moments of lift that we make sure that when women come together and women and men come together and we give women this small lift in society, they will rocket us to new places. And that's what I know and believe about women. And during this time of this pandemic, what I have been so inspired by are the young men and women coming out with their voices and saying, no more. These systematic race issues that we have in the United States and we've had for centuries, no more. We're going to stand up together and say, we want to create change. And I see it there. I see it in women's collectives. I see it in male leaders coming forward and saying, we're going to change things in our country for domestic violence that we know exists and is finally being exposed. That to me is lift, because that's when we change the cracks in society and we build back a society that lifts everybody up, men and women equally, and children and the elderly.
Thank you. Thank you so much. You're actually 1 minute over. So I'm so grateful for your time. This was a fascinating conversation. I'm glad to end it on moments of lift. That is a wonderful way to conclude this. And I'd like to hand the floor back to Sophie, who will conclude this conversation. Thank you. Thank you, Melinda. This is wonderful.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Melinda and Francesca, for such a powerful conversation, such an amazing demonstration of your Catholic power, Melinda, and of the power of women as the engine of society. I will remember when you say when women have the means to act and a seat at the table and a voice in the design of inclusive solution, we can create a much better world for everyone. And I also remembered very vividly, you say the importance of also creating space for other people, other women to come at the table, those who don't necessarily yet have a voice. That was such a rich exchange, for which I heartfully thank you on behalf of the Women's Forum. I would like to tell everyone that this conversation will be available on YouTube and on the Women's Forum website. You can also look forward to our final fireside chat, the final one of this wonderful series with Kristalina Georgieva, the managing director of the IMF, on the July 29th at 6 p.m. And on this wonderful end evening in Europe and afternoon in the US, I bid you farewell and thank you very much for your participation. Goodbye.